In high society, Patricia Wainwright, a self-made millionaire admired for her elegance and lavish lifestyle, appeared successful and adored. Yet beneath her sophisticated exterior, she faced a profound loneliness that wealth couldn't alleviate. At 55, Patricia had everything, except the one thing she desired most: genuine companionship. Her previous marriages, though financially secure, had left her emotionally hollow. The glamorous events, luxurious vacations, and endless praise from acquaintances all felt empty without someone to share them with. This void grew larger with each passing year, gnawing at her until it became an obsession. It was during one of these charity events that Patricia first laid eyes on Julian Carter, a man half her age but brimming with charisma. At 28, Julian was the picture of youthful ambition, handsome, charming, and hungry for success. He was a struggling artist, trying to make a name for himself in a world that seemed indifferent to his talents. But he had something else, a magnetism that drew people to him, and Patricia was no exception. Their meeting was purely by chance. Julian was working the event as a photographer, capturing the lavish evening for a local magazine. As he moved through the crowd, his eyes met Patricia's. There was an instant connection, an unspoken understanding that passed between them. For Julian, it was an opportunity. For Patricia, it was a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Their conversation that night was brief, but it left a lasting impression on Patricia. She found herself thinking about Julian more and more in the days that followed. He was different from the men she was accustomed to, those polished, wealthy suitors who were more interested in her bank account than her. Julian, with his rough edges and unfiltered honesty, was a breath of fresh air. Patricia began to seek Julian out, inviting him to more events, offering him work, and eventually inviting him into her life. At first, it was all professional, a mutually beneficial arrangement where Julian provided his artistic services and Patricia offered her patronage. But as they spent more time together, their relationship grew deeper, evolving from business to something far more personal. Julian, aware of Patricia's wealth and influence, didn't resist her advances. In fact, he played into them, knowing that a relationship with her could open doors that had previously been closed to him. He charmed her, complimented her, made her feel young again. And Patricia, starved for affection, fell headlong into the affair. As their relationship intensified, Patricia's attachment to Julian grew stronger, almost dangerously so. What had started as a thrilling escape from her mundane reality quickly morphed into a deep-seated obsession. She showered Julian with expensive gifts, funded his art projects, and introduced him to her influential network, hoping to elevate his career. But her generosity came with strings attached, strings that tightened with each passing day. Patricia's need for control began to overshadow the relationship. She became possessive, needing constant reassurance of Julian's affection. She would call him at all hours, demanding to know where he was, who he was with, and what he was doing. When he didn't respond immediately, she would spiral into fits of jealousy and anger, convinced that he was slipping away from her. Julian, sensing the shift in Patricia's behavior, tried to maintain a balance. He knew that her wealth and connections were his ticket to the success he desperately craved, but he also felt suffocated by her demands. He began to distance himself, spending more time with friends and less with Patricia. But this only fueled her paranoia, deepening her obsession. To placate her, Julian would make grand gestures of affection, telling her what she wanted to hear, even when his heart wasn't in it. He played the role of the devoted lover, all the while feeling trapped in a relationship that was becoming increasingly toxic. Patricia, blinded by her desire to keep him close, ignored the warning signs, believing that their love was too strong to falter. As the months went on, Patricia's behavior grew more erratic. She would show up unannounced at Julian's apartment, questioning him about his whereabouts and rifling through his belongings for any sign of betrayal. She began to isolate him from his friends and family, insisting that he spend all his time with her. What had once been a passionate affair was now a prison, one that neither could easily escape. But the more Julian pulled away, the tighter Patricia's grip became. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, of returning to the emptiness that had plagued her before he came into her life. The obsession that had once been a source of excitement had now become a dark, consuming force, driving her to actions she never would have imagined. Patricia's life, once so meticulously crafted and controlled, was beginning to unravel at the seams. The lavish parties, the opulent lifestyle, and the prestigious social circles she had so carefully cultivated were no longer enough to distract her from the chaos brewing within. Her obsession with Julian had taken on a life of its own, consuming her thoughts and dictating her every move. Her friends noticed the change, whispering behind her back about her erratic behavior and increasingly possessive nature. Once admired for her poise and composure, Patricia was now seen as desperate and unstable. But she didn't care. All that mattered was Julian, the man who had become the center of her universe, the one thing she could not bear to lose. Julian, on the other hand, was growing more distant by the day. The thrill of their relationship had long since faded, replaced by a sense of dread that gnawed at him every time he saw Patricia's name flash on his phone. He had tried to end things several times, but each attempt was met with a torrent of tears, pleas, and promises that things would get better. And each time he caved, knowing that walking away completely could have devastating consequences for his career, and more importantly, for his safety. Patricia's jealousy had reached a fever pitch. She monitored Julian's every move, hiring private investigators to follow him, tracking his phone, and even bribing his friends for information. She was convinced that he was seeing someone else, someone younger, prettier, and less complicated. The mere thought drove her to the brink of madness. Her desperation led her to make a series of increasingly irrational decisions. She began to confront women she believed were involved with Julian, accosting them in public, and accusing them of trying to steal him away. She would send threatening messages, warning them to stay away, and spreading vicious rumors to tarnish their reputations. These actions only served to alienate Patricia further from her social circle, but she was beyond caring. All that mattered was keeping Julian close. The strain of the situation was taking its toll on Julian as well. His work was suffering, his relationships with friends and family were strained, and his mental health was deteriorating. He began to drink heavily, seeking solace in alcohol to numb the anxiety that Patricia's constant presence brought. He knew that he was trapped in a dangerous game, one that could end in disaster if he didn't find a way out. But Patricia's obsession had taken on a life of its own, and there was no turning back. She couldn't bear the thought of Julian leaving her, of facing the emptiness that had haunted her before he came into her life. And as her grip tightened, so too did the noose around Julian's neck, pulling him deeper into the dark, twisted world she had created. The stage was set for a tragedy that neither of them could escape, a tragedy born from a love that had long since turned to poison. As the tension between Patricia and Julian reached its breaking point, it became clear that their relationship was teetering on the edge of disaster. Patricia's once subtle attempts to control Julian had become overt and suffocating, leaving him with no room to breathe. The woman who had once seemed so glamorous and alluring was now a figure of fear and dread in Julian's life, her presence a constant reminder of the twisted obsession that bound them together. Julian, desperate for freedom, began to devise a plan to escape Patricia's grasp. He knew that breaking up with her outright could provoke a dangerous reaction. Patricia had become unpredictable, and he feared what she might do if he rejected her completely. Instead, he decided to distance himself gradually, hoping that she would lose interest or find someone else to focus on. But Patricia was too deeply entrenched in her obsession to let go so easily. She noticed Julian's attempts to pull away, the missed calls, the excuses to avoid seeing her, the sudden disinterest in the lavish gifts she offered. Her suspicions grew, and with them, her determination to keep him close at all costs. The breaking point came on a cold winter evening when Patricia, driven by paranoia and desperation, decided to confront Julian once and for all. She showed up at his apartment unannounced, her eyes wild with fear and anger. Julian, caught off guard, tried to remain calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. "What's going on, Julian?" Patricia demanded, her voice trembling. "You've been avoiding me. I know something's wrong. Just tell me the truth." Julian hesitated, torn between his desire to end the relationship and his fear of what Patricia might do if he pushed her too far. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Patricia, I've been feeling overwhelmed," he began, trying to keep his tone measured. "This relationship, it's become too much for me. I need some space, some Time to figure things out. But Patricia wasn't satisfied with his vague response. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, her voice rising in pitch. Space? What do you mean, space? Are you seeing someone else? Is that what this is about? Julian shook his head, trying to placate her. No, it's not about anyone else. It's just, I need to focus on my work, on myself. I can't keep going like this. But Patricia wasn't listening. Her mind was racing, filled with dark thoughts and worst-case scenarios. In her eyes, Julian's words were a confirmation of her deepest fears, that he was slipping away from her, that she was losing control, and she couldn't bear it. In that moment, something inside Patricia snapped. The fear of losing Julian, of returning to the emptiness that had haunted her for so long, overwhelmed her. She couldn't let him leave. She wouldn't let him leave. If she couldn't have him, no one else could. Without thinking, Patricia made a decision that would seal both their fates. Her mind, clouded by desperation and obsession, convinced her that there was only one way to ensure that Julian would never leave her. It was a decision born from madness, a final, irrevocable act that would plunge them both into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The night air was thick with tension as Patricia drove to Julian's apartment, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, and a deep, unyielding need to possess him entirely. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as she replayed their conversation over and over in her mind. Julian had said he needed space, that he wanted time to think. But Patricia couldn't allow that. Space meant distance, and distance meant losing him forever. When she arrived at Julian's building, she found herself trembling. But this wasn't the trembling of fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was the trembling of someone on the brink of making an irreversible decision. She sat in her car for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. But the thoughts in her head wouldn't stop. They pounded relentlessly, driving her toward the conclusion that had been building for weeks. Patricia stepped out of the car, her footsteps echoing on the pavement as she made her way to the entrance. The familiar path up to Julian's door felt different this time, laden with the weight of what she was about to do. She reached the door and with a deep breath, she knocked. Firmly, insistently. Julian inside was startled by the sound. He had been trying to clear his head to figure out how to deal with Patricia without provoking her. But it was too late for that now. The knock was a harbinger of what was to come. Reluctantly, he opened the door, finding Patricia standing there, her eyes wide and intense. "Patricia, what are you doing here? We talked about this." Before Julian could finish, Patricia pushed past him, entering the apartment with a determined stride. There was an edge to her that Julian hadn't seen before, something cold, almost predatory. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed to crackle with impending doom. "You're not thinking clearly, Julian," Patricia said, her voice low and steady, though there was an unmistakable undercurrent of hysteria. "You don't understand what we have. You're just confused. But I'm here to help you see it." Julian's heart began to race. He could see the wild look in Patricia's eyes, the way her hands shook slightly as she spoke. "Patricia, please, let's just calm down. We need to talk about this rationally." But rationality had long since left Patricia. She paced the room, her mind spinning out of control as she spoke, words tumbling out in a rush. "I've given you everything, Julian, everything. My time, my money, my love, and you. You think you can just walk away? After all we've been through?" Julian tried to approach her, his voice soothing. "Patricia, no one's walking away. I just need—" But she cut him off, her voice rising in intensity. "No! No more lies, Julian. No more excuses. You think you can fool me? I know what you've been doing. I know about the other women, about your plans to leave me." Julian took a step back, fear creeping into his voice. "Patricia, you're not thinking straight. There's no one else." But Patricia wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind, and nothing Julian said could change it. Her hands slipped into her coat pocket, fingers curling around the cold, hard object she had brought with her, the object that would ensure Julian never left her side. "Don't you see, Julian?" she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We were meant to be together, forever, and I won't let anyone take you away from me." Julian's eyes widened as he saw the glint of metal in Patricia's hand, the realization dawning on him too late. "Patricia, no!" But his words were cut off by the sound of a gunshot, the deafening crack echoing through the small apartment. Julian staggered, his hand clutching his chest as he fell to the floor, blood seeping through his shirt, staining the carpet beneath him. For a moment the world stood still. Patricia stood over Julian's lifeless body, the gun still in her hand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, the enormity of her actions crashing down on her like a tidal wave. But there was no going back now. The woman who had once been the epitome of grace and sophistication had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her obsession, her need to control, had led her to commit the ultimate act of possession, a final, fatal blow that ensured Julian would never leave her. But in doing so, she had lost everything. The wealth, the status, the respect. All of it was gone, evaporating in the wake of the terrible crime she had just committed. And as Patricia stood there, gun in hand, staring down at the man she had once claimed to love, she realized with a hollow, sinking feeling that she was truly alone. Alone in a way she had never been before, with nothing left but the remnants of her shattered obsession and the consequences that would soon come crashing down on her. In the eerie silence that followed the gunshot, Patricia stood motionless, her mind reeling from the magnitude of what she had done. The room, once a haven of their ill-fated romance, was now a crime scene, a place where love had turned to madness and obsession had led to murder. Julian's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, a stark reminder of the irrevocable act Patricia had committed. Reality began to seep in slowly, like a cold, creeping fog. Patricia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. She stared at the blood-stained gun in her hand, her fingers still wrapped tightly around it, as if it were the only thing grounding her to the moment. The shock of the situation was overwhelming, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Patricia wondered if it was all just a terrible nightmare, one she might still wake up from. But this was no dream. The weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders, dragging her down into a pit of despair. She had killed Julian. Julian, the man she had loved so intensely, the man she couldn't bear to lose. And now he was gone, taken by her own hand. The magnitude of the loss, of the emptiness that now consumed her, was more than she could bear. As the adrenaline began to fade, panic set in. Patricia's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out of the nightmare she had created. She dropped the gun, her hands trembling uncontrollably, and backed away from Julian's body. What had she done? How could she have let it come to this? Her thoughts spiraled, but there was no escape from the reality of the situation. Patricia knew that the authorities would soon come knocking, that the life she had meticulously crafted was about to come crashing down. There would be no more charity galas, no more exclusive lunches, no more adoring fans. Her reputation, her wealth, her freedom, everything she had once held dear, was about to be stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the haunting memory of what she had done. Patricia's first instinct was to run, to flee the scene and disappear before anyone could connect her to the crime. But deep down, she knew it was futile. The evidence was overwhelming. Her fingerprints on the gun, her presence at the scene, the mountain of witnesses who knew about her obsessive relationship with Julian. There was no escaping the consequences now. The weight of that realization crushed her, leaving Patricia feeling utterly defeated. She slumped to the floor, her back against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the lifeless form of the man she had once loved. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. They were supposed to be together, forever, her and Julian, living a life of luxury and passion. But instead, her obsession had destroyed everything. Minutes passed, though to Patricia it felt like an eternity. The sound of sirens in the distance finally broke through her haze of despair, their wailing cry growing louder and louder until they were right outside Julian's apartment. Patricia didn't move. There was no point. She had nowhere to go, nothing left to fight for. When the police burst through the door, guns drawn, they found Patricia sitting on the floor, her face streaked with tears, her expression vacant. The scene before them was clear. Julian's lifeless body, the gun lying nearby, and Patricia, the woman who had once been the envy of everyone around her, now reduced to a shadow of her former self. Patricia didn't resist as they handcuffed her, didn't protest as they read her rights. She simply stood, numb to the world around her, as they led her out of the apartment and into the waiting police car. The media would have a field day with the story, a wealthy socialite brought down by a dark and twisted obsession. But none of that mattered to Patricia anymore. The life she had once cherished was gone, replaced by a bleak, empty future, one that would be spent in the cold, unforgiving confines of a prison cell. As the car pulled away, Patricia allowed herself one last look at the apartment building, the place where it had all begun and where it had all come to a tragic, inevitable end. There was no going back now. The woman she had once been was gone, lost forever to the darkness of her own making. The trial of Patricia Langley quickly became a media sensation. Every detail of the case, from her lavish lifestyle to her obsessive relationship with Julian, was splashed across the headlines. News outlets around the world competed to provide the most salacious coverage, transforming Patricia from a wealthy socialite into a figure of public scorn and morbid fascination. In the courtroom, Patricia sat stoically, her once glamorous appearance now reduced to a shadow of its former self. The confidence that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look in her eyes. The prosecution painted her as a woman driven mad by obsession, a controlling lover who couldn't bear to lose the object of her affection. They detailed how Patricia had used her wealth and influence to keep Julian in her grasp and how, when that wasn't enough, she had resorted to violence. Julian's friends and family took the stand, their testimonies painting a picture of a young man trapped in a relationship he had grown to fear. They spoke of his attempts to distance himself from Patricia, of the strain she had put on his life, and of the dread he felt in the days leading up to his death. Their words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper into the fragile facade Patricia had built around herself. The defense, on the other hand, tried to portray Patricia as a victim of her own emotions, an emotionally unstable woman who had been pushed to the brink by the fear of abandonment. They argued that Patricia had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, that the crime was not premeditated, but rather the tragic result of a mind unraveling under the weight of unbearable stress. But the evidence against Patricia was damning. The private investigators she had hired, the threatening messages she had sent to women she believed were involved with Julian, the meticulous way she had tracked his every move. It all pointed to a pattern of behavior that was anything but impulsive. The jury saw through the defense's attempts to garner sympathy, and after a brief deliberation, they returned with a verdict of guilty. The judge, unmoved by the defense's pleas for leniency, sentenced Patricia to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of camera flashes and shouted questions as Patricia was led away in handcuffs, her fate sealed. The woman who had once been a pillar of high society was now a convicted murderer, her name forever tarnished by the scandal that had brought her down. As the public watched Patricia's downfall, they were both horrified and captivated by the story, a real-life tragedy that seemed ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel. For many, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, a reminder that even the most privileged lives can spiral into darkness when consumed by the wrong desires. But for Patricia, it was the end of everything she had ever known, the final chapter in a life that had been marked by wealth, power, and ultimately, destruction. Years passed, but the memory of Patricia Langley's crime continued to linger in the public consciousness. The case became the subject of true crime documentaries, books, and countless online discussions, each one dissecting the events that had led to that fateful night. Some painted Patricia as a villain, a manipulative woman who had destroyed everything in her path to satisfy her twisted desires. Others saw her as a tragic figure, a woman undone by her own emotions in the pressures of a society that valued appearances above all else. In prison, Patricia became a ghost of her former self. The sharp, calculating mind that had once dominated social circles was now dulled by years of confinement. She spent her days in solitude, haunted by the memories of Julian and the life they could never have. The other inmates kept their distance, wary of the woman whose story had captivated the world. Yet they couldn't help but whisper about her when she passed by. She was a living reminder of how far one could fall, of how even the most powerful could be brought low by their own inner demons. Patricia's story also left a lasting impact on those who had known her before the crime. Her former friends and acquaintances, once eager to bask in her wealth and influence, now spoke of her with a mixture of pity and contempt. For them, Patricia's downfall was a sobering lesson about the dangers of allowing ambition and desire to go unchecked. The glamorous parties, the luxurious lifestyle, it had all been a facade, masking the deep insecurities and fears that had ultimately led to tragedy. As the years went by, the details of Patricia's crime began to fade from the public eye, replaced by new scandals and stories. But the core of her tale remained a potent reminder of the destructive power of obsession. It was a story that spoke to the darkest corners of the human heart, to the places where love turns to madness, and where the need for control can consume everything in its path. In the end, Patricia Langley became a cautionary figure, her name synonymous with the dangers of letting one's desires rule their life. Her story was a testament to the fragility of the human mind, to how even the most carefully constructed lives can unravel in an instant when driven by fear and obsession. And as the world moved on, Patricia remained behind, a prisoner not just of the walls around her, but of the choices that had led her there. A tragic figure in a story of love gone horribly wrong.